The coffee in my hand had gone cold 20 minutes ago, but I didn't notice. I was too busy watching my son laugh. Not the way a son laughs when he's happy. Not the kind of laugh I'd heard 1,000 times at the kitchen table or on Christmas morning, or when I used to chase him around the backyard when he was 6 years old and the world was still simple. This was a different laugh. Loose. Careless. The laugh of a man who doesn't know he's being watched. He was standing outside a restaurant on Maple Grove Avenue, the kind of place with cloth napkins and a wine list that costs more than my first car. He had his arm around a woman I didn't recognize, leaning in close, whispering something that made her cover her mouth and giggle. My son. My Daniel. The boy I had poured 31 years of my life into. And just 20 feet behind him, partially hidden by the wide trunk of an oak tree I'd parked next to by accident, I sat in my old Buick, completely invisible to him, watching everything fall apart. I hadn't gone there to spy on him. I want to make that clear. I was on my way home from the hardware store, stopped at a red light and happened to glance to my right. That's all it took. One glance, 20 seconds, and suddenly everything I thought I knew about my son, about my family, started to crack right down the middle. But to understand why that moment nearly broke me, you need to understand what came before it. My name is Gerald Whitmore. I'm 63 years old. I worked 37 years as a structural engineer for a mid-sized firm in Columbus, Ohio. I built bridges, designed load-bearing frameworks for office buildings, reviewed safety specs on highway overpasses. My whole career was about making sure things held together, that things didn't collapse. My wife, Lorraine, passed away 8 years ago, pancreatic cancer. The kind that doesn't give you much warning and doesn't give you much time. We had 14 months from diagnosis to funeral, and I spent every single one of them by her side. We had been married for 34 years. She was the first person I'd ever loved and the only person I ever needed. When she died, I didn't fall apart the way people expected me to. I got quiet instead. Grief for me was like concrete setting. It hardened slowly, and once it set, it didn't move. I threw myself into work for another 2 years, retired at 61, and tried to figure out what life looked like without her in it. What it looked like, mostly, was Daniel. Our son was 30 years old when Lorraine passed. He'd grown up well, or so I believed. He'd graduated from Ohio State, built a decent career in financial consulting, married a woman named Priya who I genuinely liked from the moment I met her. They had a daughter together, my granddaughter Rosie, who was 4 years old and had Lorraine's eyes and my stubbornness and her mother's laugh. That little girl was the only reason some mornings felt worth getting out of bed. After I retired, Daniel and I had fallen into a comfortable rhythm. Sunday dinners at his place twice a month, Saturday morning calls. He'd come help me with yard work in the fall, and I'd take Rosie to the zoo in the spring. We were close, I thought. We were solid. The kind of father and son who didn't need to say everything out loud because the foundation was already there. I had also, somewhere in the past 3 years, made Daniel my financial power of attorney. That decision would nearly cost me everything. It started small, the way most disasters do. About 18 months before that afternoon on Maple Grove Avenue, I noticed my investment account balance seemed lower than it should have been. I was drawing a small monthly withdrawal for living expenses, modest, nothing extravagant, but the numbers weren't adding up the way I expected. I figured I'd made an error. Maybe I'd miscounted. I was 62, recently retired, still getting used to monitoring things on my own. I mentioned it to Daniel during one of our Sunday dinners. Casually, over pot roast, the way you'd mention you couldn't find your reading glasses. He nodded, said he'd look into it, told me the markets had been volatile and that some of my allocations might need rebalancing. He spoke with the smooth, reassuring confidence of someone who does this for a living. I felt better immediately. I didn't look again for 3 months. When I did, the balance had dropped another $22,000. This time, I sat down properly with my statements, spread them out on the kitchen table under the good lamp, put on my reading glasses, and went through them the way I used to go through structural calculations methodically, without assumption. What I found made me set down my pen and sit very still for a long time. There were withdrawals I hadn't made. Not large ones, never anything that would trigger an immediate alarm. 4,300 here, 6,200 there. Transfers to an account number I didn't recognize, labeled simply with a reference code that meant nothing to me. 14 separate transactions over 8 months, totaling just over $61,000. I picked up the phone to call Daniel, then I put it back down. Something stopped me. Some instinct, some quiet warning that I couldn't quite name. Instead of calling my son, I called my accountant, a man named Roy Briggs who had done my taxes for 20 years and who I trusted completely. "Roy," I said, "I need you to come to the house, and I need you to not tell anyone you're coming." Roy arrived the next morning. He sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad and went through every statement I owned. When he looked up at me 3 hours later, his expression was the expression of a man who is choosing his words carefully. "Gerald," he said quietly, "you need to call an attorney." I didn't call an attorney that week. I wasn't ready. There's a particular kind of pain that comes with suspecting someone you love of betrayal. It's not sharp and immediate like physical pain. It's slow. It seeps into everything. You find yourself replaying conversations, re-examining expressions, searching memory for the moments you should have seen it coming and hating yourself for not having seen them sooner. I went back through 2 years of our relationship in my mind. The Sunday dinners, the Saturday calls, the time Daniel had helped me refinance my modest mortgage 18 months ago, something I hadn't initially wanted to do, but he'd made a convincing case for it. The way he'd been the one to suggest I make him power of attorney after Lorraine died, framing it as practical, as caring, as something Lorraine herself would have wanted. I thought about Priya, my daughter-in-law, who had started seeming uncomfortable around me at family gatherings, quieter than usual, eyes that slid away from mine. I'd assumed she was stressed, overworked, navigating the particular exhaustion of a young mother. Now I wondered if she knew. I wondered what she knew. And I thought about Rosie, who had no idea that the adults around her were quietly dismantling something irreparable. That was the thought that finally made me cry, not for myself, for that little girl with Lorraine's eyes. I gave myself 1 week to grieve privately. Then I called an attorney. Her name was Margaret Osai, and she had been recommended to me by Roy as someone who handled exactly these kinds of cases: financial elder abuse within families, misuse of power of attorney, trust violations. She was 55, precise, and completely without sentimentality when it came to the law, which was exactly what I needed. "This is more common than people realize," she told me in her office, which was clean and quietly serious, with framed law degrees and a single photo on the desk of a woman and 2 teenage children. Adult children with power of attorney, particularly when a surviving parent is recently widowed and grieving. It happens. People mistake vulnerability for an opportunity. "He's my son," I said, and those 3 words carried the weight of 31 years. She looked at me with an expression that was neither cold nor falsely warm. "I know," she said. "That makes it harder. It doesn't make it different." She advised me to do something that went against every instinct I had. She told me not to confront Daniel yet, not to change my accounts yet, not to do anything that would alert him. She needed time to build a complete picture, and if Daniel realized I knew, he might move money, destroy records, or take other steps to protect himself. "Can you do that?" she asked. "Can you keep meeting him for Sunday dinners and Saturday calls and not let him know?" I thought about the bridges I'd spent my career building, the way you had to be patient with the foundations, the way you could not rush the concrete. "Yes," I said, "I can do that." And so I did. For 6 weeks, I sat across the dinner table from my son and watched him cut his pot roast and pour his wine and toss Rosie in the air while she shrieked with laughter. and I smiled and nodded and asked about his work, and told him a funny story about a neighbor's dog, and I felt something dying very quietly inside me the entire time. There were moments when I almost broke. One Saturday morning he called and his voice was so warm, so familiar, so much like the voice of the boy who used to ask me to check under his bed for monsters that I nearly said it. Nearly just said, "Daniel, I know. What happened to you? What happened to us?" But I held on. For Lorraine, who had trusted me to keep this family together. For Rosie, who deserved to have the full picture before anything fell apart. And honestly, for myself, because I wanted to know everything before I said a single word. Margaret's investigator found the other account within 2 weeks. It was registered to an LLC Daniel had formed 18 months ago, right around the time he'd helped me refinance. The LLC had no real business activity. It was, as Margaret explained to me with careful precision, a shell, a place to put money that wasn't his. But that wasn't the worst of it. The worst of it came on a Tuesday afternoon when her investigator sent over a photograph. Not a surveillance photograph, just a social media image, posted publicly, that Daniel had apparently forgotten was visible. It showed him and a woman at some kind of outdoor event, a vineyard or a garden party, both dressed nicely, both smiling the way people smile when they're happy and they think no one important is watching. The woman's name, according to her tagged profile, was Cassidy Vance. She was 34 years old, and she appeared, based on the LLC's registered address and a trail of financial records Margaret's investigator had followed with impressive thoroughness, to be the reason Daniel needed the money. A second life. My son had built himself a second life, and he had funded it with mine. That was a Thursday, and on the following Saturday afternoon, on my way home from the hardware store, I stopped at a red light on Maple Grove Avenue. And there was Daniel, outside that restaurant with the cloth napkins, his arm around Cassidy Vance, laughing the laugh of a man who doesn't know he's being watched. I sat in my Buick for 12 minutes. I watched him open the restaurant door for her. I watched him put his hand on the small of her back with a casual familiarity that told me this was not new, not experimental, not a mistake he was agonizing over. I watched him glance at his phone, probably checking the time, and then pocket it and follow her inside. I sat there until the light changed 4 more times. Then I drove home, made myself a cup of tea, sat down at the kitchen table and called Margaret. "I saw him today," I said, "with her." There was a brief silence. "Are you all right?" "No," I said, "but I'm ready." What happened next was not the way revenge looks in the movies. There was no dramatic confrontation, no raised voices in a restaurant, no public scene, no moment where I appeared in a doorway and watched his face fall. Margaret had been very clear about this. Emotional confrontation without legal groundwork would give Daniel time to maneuver. We needed to be methodical. We needed to be, as she put it, significantly ahead of him before he knows the race has started. So we built the case the way I used to build bridges, support by support. Margaret filed a petition to revoke Daniel's power of attorney, citing documented misuse. Simultaneously, she engaged a forensic accountant, a quiet, bespectacled man named Howard who seemed to find financial records the way some people find crossword puzzles, with relish and complete absorption, to trace every dollar that had moved through that LLC. The final number when Howard had finished was $94,312, over 19 months. I sat with that number for a while. It wasn't the largest sum in the world, but it was the amount my son had decided my trust was worth, the price he'd put on 31 years. The legal notice was served to Daniel on a Wednesday morning. I know this because Margaret called me when it was done, and I remember standing in my backyard, watching 2 cardinals in the oak tree by the fence and feeling something settle in me. Not peace exactly, not yet, but the particular quiet of a decision made and acted upon. Daniel called me 11 minutes later. I let it ring. He called again and again. Then a text, "Dad, I need to talk to you." Then, "Dad, please." Then, after a long pause, "I'm sorry." I read that last one several times. "I'm sorry." Two words sent in a panic designed to stop the mechanism that was already in motion. I thought about all the Sunday dinners, all the Saturday calls, all the times he'd looked me in the eye and asked how I was doing while he was moving my money into a shell company to fund a second life with another woman. I put my phone in my pocket and went inside. Priya called 2 days later. She left a voicemail, and her voice on it was raw in a way that told me she was not performing, not calculating, just genuinely undone. "Gerald," she said, "I didn't know. I need you to know that. I had no idea about any of it, the money, any of it. I found out when the legal notice came, and I don't know what to do. I'm scared. And I'm so sorry." I called her back that evening. We talked for a long time. Priya, it emerged, had been noticing things for over a year but had been told by Daniel, repeatedly and convincingly, that she was being anxious and paranoid, and that his work required privacy. He had moved their joint finances around in ways he explained as tax strategy. He had been absent in ways he attributed to work travel. She was a woman who had trusted her husband, and he had used that trust the same way he'd used mine, as a resource to be managed rather than a relationship to be honored. "What are you going to do?" I asked her. A long silence. "I've already called an attorney," she said. "Mine." For the first time in weeks, something in my chest loosened, not fully, but a little. "Priya," I said, "whatever happens, you and Rosie are my family. That doesn't change." She cried then, quietly, the way people cry when they've been holding something for too long. The civil case took 4 months to resolve. Daniel, faced with the forensic accounting records and the paper trail that Howard had assembled with the enthusiasm of a man doing the work of his life, did not contest it. His attorney, someone younger and less experienced than Margaret, which Margaret noted with a professional satisfaction she did not try very hard to conceal, negotiated a settlement. Daniel would repay the full $94,000, plus Margaret's fees, plus the forensic accounting costs, on a structured payment plan. He would surrender any remaining claim to power of attorney or any future financial role in my affairs, and he would provide a signed, notarized acknowledgement of what he had done, not for legal purposes exactly, but because Margaret had learned over 25 years of practice that documented acknowledgement mattered to people like me, that it was sometimes the only closure available. I never went to court. I never had to sit across a room from him and watch him be dismantled. I had imagined I might want that. I had imagined there would be something satisfying about it. But when the settlement was reached and Margaret called me with the details, I realized what I actually felt was tired. Deeply, profoundly tired. Not defeated, just tired the way you are when something very long and very heavy is finally over. What about Daniel himself? He lost his marriage. Priya filed for divorce within the month, and while they were navigating joint custody, she had a very good attorney and a very clear record of his behavior, and she was, as I had suspected from the moment I met her, a woman of considerably more substance than my son had apparently understood. He lost Cassidy too, at least according to the brief, uncomfortable phone call Daniel made to me 3 months after the settlement. I hadn't expected him to call. I hadn't been sure I would pick up. I did, after 4 rings, mostly because Lorraine's voice in my memory told me that whatever I'd lost with my son, I should at least hear him out once. He sounded smaller on the phone than he ever had, like something structural had been removed from him, and he hadn't yet figured out how to stand without it. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said. I needed to tell you that I know what I did, all of it, and I know there's no excuse." "There isn't," I agreed. Another long silence. "I don't know what happened to me, Dad, I really don't." I thought about that. I thought about all the things I could say. I thought about Lorraine, who would have wanted me to say something generous. I thought about Rosie, who deserved a grandfather and a father, even if those two men were going to have to figure out a new geometry for existing in each other's lives. I don't know either, I finally said, but I think you need to find out, not for me, for your daughter. I didn't say I forgave him. I wasn't there yet. Maybe I would be someday. Maybe I wouldn't. But I said what I could honestly say, and I think that was the right choice. We hung up. I sat in my kitchen for a while. Then I got up and watered Lorraine's African violets, which I'd kept alive on the windowsill for 8 years through what I could only describe as sheer bloody-mindedness, and I watched the light come through the glass and move across the countertop the way it had when she was still here. There's an aftermath to these things that no one really prepares you for. The legal part resolves, the financial part resolves, and then you're left standing in the space where a relationship used to be, trying to figure out what, if anything, is worth salvaging. I'm not going to tell you I handled it with grace. There were nights when the anger came back, hard and sudden, like a rogue wave you didn't see coming. There were mornings when I woke up early with the particular loneliness of being 63 years old and having discovered that one of the two people you loved most in the world was capable of something you never believed he was capable of. There were also, I'll admit, moments of unexpected lightness. Roy taking me out for breakfast and telling me, with the bluntness of a man who has been your accountant for 20 years, that I was tougher than I looked. Margaret shaking my hand at the close of the case with a warmth that broke through her professional precision. Howard the forensic accountant sending me a Christmas card, which I found oddly touching. And Rosie, most of all Rosie. The arrangement that Priya and Daniel worked out allowed Priya to bring Rosie to see me twice a month, separate from Daniel's own visits, which resumed slowly and carefully, and never quite without the particular tension of people who are rebuilding something from a foundation that has been partially destroyed. Rosie didn't know any of it, of course. She was 5 now, and to her, Grandpa Gerald was simply Grandpa Gerald. The man who took her to the zoo and let her help water the plants and made the grilled cheese sandwiches exactly the way she liked them, with the crusts cut off in triangles instead of strips. One afternoon in the early spring, about 8 months after the settlement, she was sitting at my kitchen table drawing with colored pencils. She was going through a phase where she drew animals with extremely detailed expressions, which Priya and I both found hilarious, and she looked up at me with Lorraine's eyes and said, without preamble, the way children say things, "Grandpa, do you miss Grandma?" I sat down across from her. "Every single day," I said honestly. She considered this with the serious weight that 5-year-olds give to serious things. "Me too," she said, even though I didn't really know her. "You have her eyes," I told her. "Did you know that?" She touched her face like she was trying to feel the shape of them. "Do they work the same?" "Better, I think," I said. "She would have loved your drawings." Rosie seemed deeply satisfied by this. She went back to her drawing. She was making a lion, I think, with raised eyebrows and an expression of polite concern. I sat there and watched her, and the kitchen was warm and the African violets were blooming on the windowsill, and I thought, this is what's left. This is what didn't break. I've thought a lot in the months since about the afternoon on Maple Grove Avenue, about sitting in my Buick with the cold coffee and watching my son laugh on the sidewalk outside a restaurant. There's a version of that moment where I get out of the car, where I cross the street, where I make it a scene, loud and immediate and public, the way some part of me, the injured, disbelieving part, wanted to. I'm glad I didn't. Not because it would have been wrong to confront him, but because patience gave me something that confrontation wouldn't have. It gave me the full picture. It gave me Margaret and Roy and Howard. It gave me a settlement and an acknowledgement and eventually a phone call where my son admitted out loud that there was no excuse for what he'd done. Patience gave me evidence instead of a scene, and evidence is durable. A scene fades. What Howard found in those financial records, what Margaret put into legal documents, What Daniel signed his name to, those things don't change. I was a structural engineer for 37 years. I know the difference between something that holds and something that only looks like it holds. My son looked solid for a long time. The structure underneath was something else entirely, and I won't pretend that doesn't grieve me, because it does, and probably always will. Parents are not supposed to outlive their faith in their children. There is no natural order that prepares you for it. But here's what I know now, at 63, sitting in a house full of African violets and a granddaughter's drawings pinned to the refrigerator and a framed photograph of Lorraine on the mantel. Surviving a betrayal doesn't mean the betrayal didn't happen. It means you found out what you're made of after it did. Lorraine used to say that the hardest thing about being human is that we are capable of so much more love than the people we love are sometimes capable of returning. She said it with sadness, but not with bitterness. She had a way of holding hard truths gently that I never fully mastered. I'm trying to learn it now, slower than she would have wanted probably, but I'm trying. Last Sunday, Daniel came for dinner. It was the third time since everything had happened, and it was still uncomfortable the way a healed fracture is sometimes still uncomfortable, not broken, not the same as before but functional. We ate at the kitchen table, the three of us. Priya had Rosie that weekend, and we talked about things that were real without talking about the thing that had changed everything. His work, which he had restructured. His apartment, which was modest and apparently something he'd been working to make feel like home. The questions he was asking himself, which he mentioned only briefly, but with a seriousness that felt earned rather than performed. I made pot roast because that's what we've always had on Sundays, some things you hold on to. At the end of the night, when he was putting on his coat by the door, he stopped and looked at me for a moment with an expression I couldn't quite read. Something unguarded in it, something young, almost the way he used to look when he was uncertain as a boy. "Dad," he said. "Yeah." He seemed to search for words and not find them. "Thanks for dinner." It wasn't what he'd meant to say. We both knew that. But it was what he had, and I accepted it, because you take what people can manage to give you and you don't punish them for the rest, not if you want anything to survive. "Come back next month," I said. He nodded. He went out into the evening. I watched his car pull away from the curb and disappear around the corner, and then I closed the door and went back to the kitchen and started clearing up. The African violets were blooming in the window. The refrigerator was covered in lion drawings with politely concerned expressions. Somewhere across town, a 5-year-old with Lorraine's eyes was probably already asleep. I stood at the sink and washed the dishes, and outside the kitchen window, the neighborhood was quiet, and the evening was ordinary, and I was still standing. I have been a structural engineer my whole life. I know what it means for something to hold. I'm still holding.